And I'm glad you mentioned having been mayor. That's when you really get called things. So let me begin by acknowledging one of the most fateful days in the history of the world, D-Day. I think that the Springfield newspaper did a terrific job commemorating that extraordinary event, and also to call attention to the odds at that time, because the war had still not had its determination decided. And again, I think it's the sacrifice and courage. Many of the individuals who came from Western Massachusetts who certainly did their part. So I think that acknowledging that the way that we have on the 75th anniversary is really important. I think with the exception of Gettysburg, that might be the battle that most Americans remember. And again, as I noted, the odds were not determined as the amphibious force landed on those beaches. But I also want to use this occasion to congratulate Wayne Fana, 50 years at the Springfield newspaper. I think that's pretty remarkable. And even though we missed Mayor LaChapelle earlier, I think she's one of the best mayors in Massachusetts, and Mayor Dave Narkowitz and Mayor Cepelli. I mean, these are really terrific people, and we are fortunate to have them along with Marie LaFlamme. I think there's a discerning factor that goes into choosing the mayor of any community. And they choose people, I think, probably with more scrutiny than most other offices. And I also think that having had that experience, that all of us should quickly come to the conclusion, the individuals that we elect as mayor, it really counts. And that's a critical, I think, part of our obligation in a democracy. So I'm going to use a moment just to make a little bit of national news. And we have released the statement just as I walked in. So it's being released here in Springfield for the Dateline, but it's also being released in Washington. And that is that next week, if the president decides to go forward with his tariffs on Mexico, I intend to offer a motion of disapproval on the House floor, and to point out that trade and tariffs are separate from immigration. Those two issues are not intertwined. And in fact, I think that the idea that we would arbitrarily offer these sort of tariffs at a time when we're coming down the home stretch of trying to figure out what to do about a new and revised 25-year-old NAFTA. And if you are upset about these trade agreements, there is a mechanism for addressing that. Using the immigration argument is not the path to take. So we intend, and I will tell you that it'll get every Democrat in the House will vote for it, and most Republicans will vote for it as well. So I think that that's an important part of our responsibilities. And in those deliberations, the Speaker has cleared that with me. We talked about it a couple of days ago when I indicated I intended to go forward. I had her support. So let me talk a little bit about national economics. And we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of what will likely be the longest spurt of economic growth in American history. It is indeed extraordinary when you consider that in the aftermath of the recession, in which we were losing 800,000 jobs a month, that we have seen the sort of job growth that now is particular to America. The European economies have been up and down. The Chinese economy has sputtered, and I think that the deliberations where I am more sympathetic to the president's position as it relates to China than I am as it relates to Mexico, obviously. But I think that you might say, well, you know, Congressman, you're the chairman of the most important committee in Congress. Where do you get your information, and how do you discern that information, and how do you digest and then pass out that decision making? So I am a believer still in mainstream democratic economics. And I think that I confer regularly with Bob Rubin, who was the former Secretary of the Treasury with Bill Clinton, and with Jack Lew, who was Secretary of the Treasury with Barack Obama. They are mainstream thinkers. And I also am a follower of Mark Zandi's work at Moody's.com. He gives a little bit of a different perspective, as you know, but his work recently is the most accurate. And followed some of his commentary as recently as this morning as the staff put information together for me. And even as we've witnessed this growth spurt, there are a couple of things that we need to be concerned about. Labor participation rates. In 1999, at the end of the Clinton administration, which was the greatest growth spurt in American history for any singular period of time, the last 4 years of that administration, 23 million jobs and 4 balanced budgets, I might add. that when you consider labor participation rates at that time were north of 68%. That meant that more than 68% of the American people went to work every day. Pretty startling number. And today, despite the fact that we've had relatively good economic news during this period of time, we also are now up against a rate that's closer to about 63% of the American people who get up and go to work every day. And the gig economy can be described, I think, as a contingency economy in some measures, right? I mean, benefits are sorely being eliminated from many workers who task that day in and day out. Their work hours are not set by them, they're set by the employer, and I think that that's a bit of a challenge. We've also witnessed the decline of unionism in America. And the downward pressure on wages in some measures a reflection of what's happened to unionism. 6% of the private sector in America is now organized. About 7% of the public sector is organized. And I call that to your attention because contrast that with the height of the New Deal, when 1 out of 3 households in America had a union member. And I don't think that it's healthy in any economy for one side to prevail ultimately. I think we're better off having these discussions back and forth, and I think that it also, as we've watched labor markets tighten and wages for the first time in 12 years start to creep up, that's a good thing for the American economy. But the other part of the challenge, as I note with worker participation rates, is that there are 2 million people who have left the workforce with opiate addiction. And we really don't know where they are. But we know this, they're unlikely to be going back to work. So when people ask about Social Security disability, in the aftermath of the recession, if you lost your job, 2 things happened. If you had an addiction, you likely claimed disability. And if you lost your job at 62, you likely claimed a Social Security benefit. And recall that by postponing that benefit every year from 62 to 69, you pick up about 7% a year. So that's a 49% increase from 62 to 70 or to 69. And we've just put out a really good retirement bill in the House of Representatives. I mean, it's the most important change in retirement in 15 years. And I'm one of the authors of that legislation, but what I'm really proud of is that 417 members of the House of Representatives voted for it. Every Democrat in the House voted for it, and all but 3 Republicans in the House voted for it, including one who votes against everything on the other side, which was fine with me. And I think that it highlights, as was noted earlier, I think right on target, that 10,000 people are leaving the workforce every day. And even if they're working longer, we still have 10,000 boomers who retire every single day. And consider this, the average Social Security benefit, average, meaning that 50% are below the average Social Security benefit, is $16,000 a year. And we've got a huge retirement problem coming in America, and I intend to make this one of the priorities of the Ways and Means Committee, and I expect to go even bigger in the course of the next few months. And Senator Grassley, who was the chairman of the Finance Committee, we've talked extensively about this, and I think that there's going to be room for accommodation on that front as well. I was at that meeting on infrastructure with the President and the Speaker. You probably have read it didn't go very well. It was startling to me because we had rehearsed our lines that morning, not to try to offer chicanery, but instead to say we need to speak in unison, try to get the President's thinking on what we would do to finance a big infrastructure bill. Because you're all for a big infrastructure bill, you're less agreed to on how to pay for it. And there's going to be an infliction of some obligation from all of us on this. We've missed now a whole generation of infrastructure improvement in America. We have not touched fuel taxes since 1993. I'm delighted with the Aer Lingus announcement for different reasons. And but when you consider what our airports are like today, our roadways, bridges, our tunnels, and we ought to use infrastructure for extending broadband, sewer and water, and giving an assist to these communities across the country. I said to Governor Baker, who I had a really good relationship with, we were talking about this recently at a meeting, and I said, Governor, I dare you to try to get off at the Sturbridge exit on Friday afternoon. I said, this is what's happened. And he agreed with me. And I think that I also pointed out that if we're to do an infrastructure program here in Massachusetts, it's not going to be Boston-centric. It's going to be equitable across the entire state because there are many parts of the state that could use this infusion of federal and state investment. we did agree with the President at the previous meeting on infrastructure to two very important considerations. One, $2 trillion. $2 trillion. And two, the 80-20 historic split between the state government at 20 and the federal government at 80%. Infrastructure is a national responsibility, and we need to be part of it. And I think that those investments will pay great dividends down the road in terms of increased efficiencies. Now, a couple of issues that are also coming up that are really important. I do think that the challenge to the tech giants is for real. And I watch young staffers that I have, and their zeal for the phone, and where I am so careful with technology, and some might argue afraid of it. But I also know that I've watched some of the problems in Washington, and it all goes back to email. Because people lay out a thought without context that is very difficult to explain to the news media. Really hard to explain. But I do think that some movement on data retrieval is really important, and how that data makes its way for sale, by the way, and how those algorithms only take you to the same conclusion time and again for sales purposes. And I've watched their pushback, and now it's more of they've come to the, I think, better position of suggesting we need to make an accommodation on this front before Congress comes down on them. And I also subscribe fully to the idea, the European notion, you have a right to be forgotten if you notify one of these companies. Liberty is next to privacy in a democratic society, and we need to treat it accordingly. So this notion that it's just out there and they're doing a public service, not so. And by the way, I get to meet with all of them. And so I've not expressed anything in this room today that I haven't expressed to them. And I also will say to staff all the time, if you don't want to read about it, don't write it down. And I think that that's another part of our obligation. There is likely to be some movement on prescription drug pricing. And so the industry has come into me, and here's the challenge we have. And it is complicated. The challenge is, how do we keep innovation and simultaneously restrain pricing? It is tricky. And the industry has been in to see me, and I mean the CEOs of these companies, and we talk, we go back and forth. And I recently said to one of them in a meeting, after he was talking about the dangers of proceeding with arbitrary decision-making here, and I said, did you happen to listen to the President's State of the Union address? I said, the idea that a Republican president would take a blowtorch to your industry, I said, is something you need to pay some attention to. He refers to it as, quote, big pharma. If you've got a Republican president saying these things and a Democratic Congress saying these things, there is likely to be an outcome. And I'm a sponsor of the STAR Act. It's passed the Ways and Means Committee unanimously. Republicans are supportive of the position that I offered. And we intend to call greater, I believe, transparency to pricing. And I think those are reasonable conclusions. Now, we don't want to kill a thriving industry either. But we do want, I think, to draw more attention as to how prices are determined. Healthcare in general. Let me say something really nice about all of you in this room for a moment. Here's where you can take great satisfaction on this day. Because of the Affordable Care Act, and I helped to write it, so I take pride in it, and I've pushed back against the critics on it. I was in the room for those day after day meetings with amendments and how we put that together. So here's where you can take satisfaction in Massachusetts. 100% of the children in Massachusetts have health insurance. 97% of the adults in Massachusetts have health insurance because of the Affordable Care Act. And what we're arguing, myself and the Speaker and others, is to build upon the Affordable Care Act, creating a notion of universal access to making sure that people in the earliest stages of challenges can get the health care that they need. Deductibles and out-of-pocket expenses are beginning again to creep into the argument. And it's causing more consternation in the marketplace, and I'm ever so hopeful that we again can find an accommodation on this front. But the effort on the other side to repeal the ACA has been not warranted, and nor has it been wise. We need stabilization in markets. And as we constructed the Affordable Care Act, we took into consideration everything. And we heard from the best economists, right, center, and left that you could hear from to develop that legislation. The idea was to promote access again, and we kept the private sector alive for the purpose of offering discipline to price. So the idea would there'd be ongoing negotiation. And I think that when you look back at it, 20 million more Americans have health insurance now than before the Affordable Care Act. But the next question is, what do we do with the last 20 million as we try to figure out how to get them into the ACA? And part of it would be governors across this country expanding Medicaid. Now, when Mr. Johnson signed the Medicare Act in 1965, which singularly is one of the greatest legislative achievements in American history, it was based on the following premise. Without regard to gender, without regard to race, there was no question of what political party one belonged to or how much you had participated in the system. You turned 65 and you joined the club. And you know what? It's pretty good health care. Now, at the same time, he simultaneously signed the Medicaid Act, and people didn't pay a lot of attention to it. His argument was, as part of the Great Society, the aftermath of the New Deal, that the notion would be, how do we get poor people into the healthcare system? And Medicaid never had the same constituency that Medicare has had. Medicare was seen as an earned benefit. Medicaid not quite having the same groundwork and groundswell of support. But in terms of expanding Medicaid across the country, we've done a pretty good job with it. At least there's an opportunity to get into the healthcare system. And I don't think this argument is going to diminish. And I assume as we proceed to next year, it's going to be in the vanguard again of much of the national deliberation. Now, the Massachusetts economy is doing well. It's doing pretty well. And I think part of it is that there's an even distribution of the success. And we've seen generally our region lags Boston by about a year in terms of economic consequence. That works both ways, by the way, for the good and the more challenging. But I think that we've seen a more equitable distribution of economic growth out here. And I also would use the moment as that young woman from SDCC offered her suggestions. The community colleges are going to be a really important part of that growth. I mean, I don't know anybody who can afford $73,000 to go to Trinity in Hartford. My oldest son went there, and he said to me, I don't know if I get in today. I said, no, you wouldn't have gotten in, don't worry. It's 73 G's. And I bring that up because the community colleges are going to be a really important part of economic growth here in the region. And also to highlight for people like yourself as you do these and undertake these deliberations, we're going to have I think, a pronounced emphasis on vocational education again as well. We've got some really great stories across Western Massachusetts as it relates to voc ed, but the voc ed argument has been lost in a lot of places. And a lot of people ended up going to college, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that, but not to miss the point that we also need plumbers and electricians, roofers, and a lot of other people along the way. And I'm ever so hopeful that this kind of, if we could just calm down the storm in Washington for 2 days, I think that we would get on to some of these sorts of discussions and considerations. So on an overall basis, it's interesting that America's international standing is in so many ways stronger than it's ever been. I mean, when we talk about the Chinese economy, for example, we still have double the Chinese economy. And when I hear about, Russia, and I say, well, California has a larger economy than Russia does. And when I hear about, the great success stories in America, it came about because of immigration. The great breakthroughs in innovation and technology, those are immigrants. I meet with them all the time. They wanted to make America their address. We should want them here. I have that argument. My grandparents were immigrants, and they wanted to make America great too. And I think that whole idea that we would shut them off the way we have, instead of saying, let's build a path to citizenship. They come here for the same reason our parents and grandparents came here. Opportunity. And a couple of footnotes. The undocumented in America, they provide an $8 billion a year surplus to the Social Security Trust Fund every year. $8 billion. And why? Because they use phony Social Security cards. But the employer nonetheless draws down the Social Security tax and the Medicare tax. You know, they work in the underground. They work so many places. I always tell the young staffers who might not see this, whenever we're in a taxi cab someplace, I will always say, you can always tell the undocumented immigrant that's driving the taxi. They actually stop for red lights. They see a stop sign, they stop because they know that the next stop could be somewhere else if they get arrested. So they pay attention. And when you look recently at some of the information on crime rates, this notion that they're career criminals is simply not valid. They come here again, as I noted a few minutes ago, for the same opportunity that our antecedents arrived here as well. So unless you have a couple of questions, and I'm happy to entertain those, it's up to you, Rick, if you want to do that. I'll be happy to take a couple of questions from you.